The clearest picture we have of how ordinary Egyptians actually wrote does not come from a temple wall or a royal tomb. It comes from garbage, broken pots, the kind of fragments scholars call ostraca. In Ptolemaic Egypt, when a farmer paid his tax, the collector did not reach for a fresh sheet of papyrus. Papyrus cost money, and you did not waste it on a receipt. Instead, he grabbed a shard from a shattered jar, dipped his reed pen, and scratched out the payment in fast, looping Demotic, the same script you can see on the Rosetta Stone, but nothing like the careful, formal version carved there. Then he tossed it in a basket with the rest of the day's takings. Thousands upon thousands of those shards survive, and together they form the most honest window we have into the living, working hand of everyday Egypt. Almost everything the public pictures when it thinks of Egyptian writing is monumental, carved, formal, built to last forever. But nobody carved a tax receipt into granite. The real business of the country ran on cursive script, and the cheapest possible surface for that cursive was a potsherd, a piece of broken ceramic, an ostracon. The plural is ostraca. They were free. They were everywhere. A household went through pottery constantly, and a broken jar became instant scrap paper. Nobody writing on one was trying to impress a god or a king, and that is precisely what makes them priceless. A funerary papyrus, something like the Book of the Dead, shows you the script at its Sunday best, copied slowly, corrected, meant to be seen. A tax ostracon shows you the same script sweating on a Tuesday afternoon, dashed off by a clerk who had 40 more receipts to write before sundown. If you want to know how people really wrote, you do not study the show writing. You study the throwaway writing. And Ptolemaic Egypt threw away a mountain of it. To understand the receipts, you first have to understand who was collecting them. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, his general Ptolemy seized Egypt and founded a Greek-speaking dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries, all the way down to Cleopatra. The Ptolemies were outsiders, and outsiders who want to extract wealth from a country they don't fully control tend to count everything. So they layered a hungry, meticulous Greek bureaucracy, headquartered first at Memphis and then at Alexandria, on top of an Egyptian population that had already been keeping written records for thousands of years. The collision produced one of the most obsessively documented tax systems anywhere in the ancient world. There were taxes on land and on harvests, on crafts and trades, on the transfer of property, on the movement of goods. There was a poll tax paid in silver, and among the best known of these was the salt tax, the hawakaye, levied on much of the adult population year after year, reaching its most systematic form under Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Every single payment had to be acknowledged. The taxpayer needed proof he had paid. The state needed proof it had collected. Multiply that across a whole country and you get an ocean of little receipts. Or rather, an ocean of inscribed broken pots. Now pick one up and a pattern jumps out. The scribe writes a tight, repeating formula, the name of the taxpayer, the tax being paid, the amount handed over, and the date reckoned not by any absolute calendar, but by the regnal year of the reigning king. Frequently the collector, or the bank that physically received the silver, is named as well. It is bookkeeping, pure and blunt, the ancient equivalent of a stamped PID. But then look at the script itself, and the real story begins. This is Demotic at its most rapid, most abbreviated, most merciless. Signs are fused into ligatures. Whole words collapse into a single shorthand stroke that a formal scribe carving a temple text would never dare use. Reading it is genuinely difficult, even for trained Egyptologists, because the writer assumed there would never be any reader except himself and perhaps his supervisor. He was not writing for posterity. He was writing to get through the afternoon. This is the moment where the evolution of hieratic and demotic scripts stops being an abstract chart of tidy letter forms and turns into one real, harried person's actual handwriting. It helps to picture where these things actually come from. Ostraka turn up in staggering numbers at settlement sites up and down the Nile, Thebes above all, and Darel Medina just across the river, where workers' villages have yielded some of the most personal ostraca ever found, but also places like Edfu and Elephantine in the south. Rubbish heaps, abandoned houses, the floors of old offices, wherever people lived and paid taxes, the sherds pile up. The scale of these discoveries keeps growing. At the site of Avaris in Upper Egypt, excavations running through the 2000s and into recent years have turned up over 43,000 ostraca, a single site, a single archive, more fragments than most scholars see in a lifetime. And receipts were only part of the traffic. Egyptians used ostraca for everything cheap and disposable. Quick letters, shopping lists, school exercises where a student practiced his signs over and over, even sketches and rough drafts. That range is a gift, because it means the same everyday script survives across every register of daily life, from a child learning to write to a professional collector logging the salt tax. The tax receipts are simply the most systematic slice of that mountain, standardized, dated, and produced in bulk by trained hands doing the same job thousands of times. If you want to study a script as it was really used, you could hardly design a better dataset than a Ptolemaic tax office's discarded pottery. Deciphering one of these ostraca is detective work in the truest sense. The dates are relative, tied to a king's regnal year. So before you can even place a sherd in time, you have to figure out which Ptolemy is meant. Often the text only yields its meaning once you have matched its formula, its place names, and its specialized tax vocabulary against hundreds of other examples. That is why these texts get published in enormous cataloged corpora and tracked in scholarly databases like Trismegistos, which stitches together the Greek and Demotic records of the very same administration. And that points to the other quiet revelation buried in these sherds. Many tax offices issued receipts in both Greek and Demotic, sometimes for the same payment, sometimes side by side. The Egyptian scribe and the Greek clerk were documenting the identical silver in two different scripts for two bureaucracies that had effectively fused into a single machine. In a sense, every one of these bilingual receipts is a miniature Rosetta Stone, the language of the rulers and the language of the rulers, writing on the same transaction, on a broken piece of pot instead of a slab of granodiorite. In a stack of ordinary receipts, you can actually watch a bilingual state at work, one shard at a time. And the content is astonishingly, almost tenderly human. These are not kings and gods and cosmic battles. They are weavers, brewers, herdsmen, and farmers, named individual people paying exactly what they owed. From them you can see how heavily a given trade was taxed, how the burden landed on ordinary households, which months' payments clustered in, and how one family's obligations shifted from year to year. A single ostracon on its own is a footnote almost meaningless, but set 10,000 of them together and an entire economy quietly reassembles itself out of fragments, a census, a ledger, a portrait of a working society. This is social history written entirely by accident, by people who believed they were just closing out a Tuesday's tax collection, and who never once imagined that a stranger 2,000 years in the future would be squinting at their rushed handwriting, trying to make out a name. So here is the payoff. The grand monuments give us the state's official voice, polished, eternal, and, let's be honest, largely propaganda. The tax ostraca give us the state's actual pulse. They preserve the everyday demotic hand in a way that no carefully recopied literary papyrus ever could, for the simple reason that nobody in history has ever slowed down to make a tax receipt beautiful. When paleographers reconstruct the evolution of hieratic and demotic scripts, these humble sherds serve as indispensable control samples, the unguarded, full-speed writing against which the polished, formal versions can finally be measured. The literal trash of Ptolemaic Egypt turned out to be its single most honest archive. But that everyday hand was not the same everywhere in Egypt. A clerk in the northern delta and a priest in the deep south were slowly drifting apart, writing the same language in increasingly different ways, until a scroll from one region could genuinely slow down a reader from the other. That's where we go next, in Memphite versus Theban, the Great Demotic Dialect Divide.